Hi, welcome to the 14-day weather forecast. Things have been very mixed recently, but are there any signs of a change as we head through the final third of March and into April? Well, as usual, I'll start by taking a look at the view across Europe and the North Atlantic. The animation runs from 18 GMT, Wednesday the 22nd, and at the outset, it's an unsettled scenario. Areas of low pressure in the Atlantic are driving things. There's a southwesterly flow moving up across all parts of the UK. It's bringing showers or longer spells of rain, and the tightly packed isobars indicate strong winds. As I run the sequence, very little changes in the short term. Further showers or longer spells of rain, strong winds, but then through the weekend there are indications that there will be a change. Colder Arctic air begins to push southwards, and the white shading there in Scotland is indicating sleet or snow. Running this through to its conclusion, the cold air makes it down across all areas, and then a ridge of high pressure builds in, and right until the end of the animation, the Atlantic is held at bay with high pressure staying close to the United Kingdom. So looking at the air temperature sequence associated with that GFS computer model run, the UK here is under green shading to start off with, so it's quite mild air aloft at about 1500 metres. In the short term, that remains the case, but then through the weekend, that blue shading moves southwards across all areas. The blue is used to indicate a cold air mass, at least aloft, and it stays there until the end, which is at 21 GMT, Wednesday the 29th. What does that mean for temperatures down at the ground level, the ones we actually experience? Friday the 24th, forecast maximums, they're still quite respectable, 12s and 13s in central and eastern England. Cold though as you head northwards into Northern Ireland and Scotland. I say colder, perhaps cooler would be a more appropriate word. Moving forwards to look at forecast minimums, Saturday the 25th, 6s, 7s, 8s in southern and central regions, a little bit lower as you head northwards, but not particularly cold by this stage. Moving forwards to Sunday afternoon, forecast maximums once more. Temperatures are now beginning to dip, single figures in virtually the whole of the UK. It's just for southwest where they remain in a little bit higher at this point. And then the overnight values are also falling. Monday the 27th, the forecast minimums here are pointing towards a widespread frost. Temperatures widely below freezing point, very low there according to this in northern England, -7 or -8 Celsius. Moving forwards to Tuesday afternoon, the maximum values once again, they're still in single figures in southern and central regions, coldest in the north. So after that relatively mild start, temperatures are trending downwards. The risk of frost is increasing in all parts of the UK. Does the Mogreps G Ensemble plot for London back up that scenario? Because there is some uncertainty, quite a lot of uncertainty about how temperatures will behave through the second half of the first week. This points towards it being fairly mild to begin with. Values there, 12, 13 Celsius perhaps through the first few days, but then through the 26th, it is turning significantly colder. That remains the case by the 27th, but the 28th and the 29th of March, there's a big spread starting to develop there. Some runs are bringing back the milder air, some are keeping it colder at this point. And going up to Inverness, just to see if that's a comparable picture. Here's the colder trend, a lot colder by the 26th. Maximums are likely to be around 3, 4 or 5 Celsius. There's a spread of runs there, which is quite narrow, but obviously they're not all in complete agreement. There is a range of scenarios being shown. But moving forwards to the 28th, the 29th, that range rapidly increases. So at this point, the runs are quite tightly clustered together. The differences between them may be only a couple of Celsius, but jump forwards a couple of days and some of the maximums are around 4 Celsius and some are closer to 12. So we've gone from a range of perhaps 2 Celsius to a range of around 8 Celsius in just a couple of days. So that's indicating a big increase in uncertainty through that time period. So between about the 26th and the 28th or the 29th of March. Will that milder air be returning northeastwards, or is the cold going to stay in place? I'll look at that again in a little bit more detail later. Wind gusts are also an issue in the short term. As I mentioned, the tightly packed isobars. London, Mogreb's G ensemble plot here, showing the possibility of gusts between 45 and 50 miles an hour on the 24th of March. Beyond that, though, the forecast wind gusts decrease on most days, in fact significantly so later on as it probably turns colder. Rainfall. Charts here for days 0 to 5, they're showing the forecast totals for that period in millimetres, the ECM model view on the left, the GFS on the right. All parts of the UK seeing rain through this period, the driest conditions probably in East Anglia, the wettest generally in the west, very much to be expected with the weather pushing in from the Atlantic. Going forwards to the 0 to 10 day period, the totals have increased everywhere. The lowest ones, though, still generally in eastern counties, the highest in the northwest. Over 100 millimetres, according to ECM, in Western Wales and northwestern England. GFS on the right has the highest totals in Western Scotland. But the general distribution between the two is quite similar. So significant amounts of rain in all parts of the UK, hopefully helping to top up the reservoirs before the summer season arrives. So, how do the deterministic models compare towards the end of the first week? Here is the GFS, which the animation was based on. The UK here, under the blue shading, indicating that the cold air mass is still in place at this point. But the Canadian model, very different. Maybe not very different on the broad scale, but very different when looking at the UK, because here, much milder air is pushing northeastwards across all areas, really. It's just perhaps the far north of Scotland, which is keeping colder conditions at this point. And the German icon model supports the Canadian one, a southwesterly flow returning. The ECM, a little bit of a halfway house actually, because colder air is still loitering over eastern Britain, but this milder flow is making significant inroads. Finally, the UK Met Office Global, well, it's a lot closer to the GFS than it is to the ECM, Canadian and Icon. Cold air it's still in place over the UK as the Atlantic struggles to return. Well, 2 keep the colder scenario, 3 going for the milder one. Really makes it quite difficult to draw any conclusions. Therefore, let's take a look at the Mogreb's G ensemble at this point. This is the UK Met Office ensemble model. The chart on the left is for Wednesday, the 29th of March, 00 GMT. The one on the right, Thursday, the 30th. They both show the forecast air temperatures from all of the runs in the Mogreb's G ensemble at those times. The thing to look at is clusters. Try to find which is the most likely solution. Is it the one where the cold air is still in place over the UK on Wednesday the 29th? According to this data, that is not the case. Most of the Mogreb's G ensemble runs are bringing milder air across most of the UK by this time. There are a few which are holding the colder air in place, just like the operational run was, but the general picture is closer to what the ECM model was showing. And the plot on the right for Thursday the 30th really supports that view, because by then milder air has returned to virtually the whole of the UK on more or less all of the runs. So I think what that suggests is that the GFS and UK Met Office operational runs are perhaps being a little bit too keen to keep that cold air mass over the UK. The majority of the data is pointing towards milder air returning northeastwards towards the end of the first week. Well, what happens as we go through week 2? As ever, it's all about trends and probabilities at this range using the Ensemble data. And I'll start with the 16-day GEFS plot for London. It shows air mass temperatures across the top, and the first thing which I'm going to highlight here before really looking at week 2 is the thick green line, which is the GFS operational. It was showing the cold air remaining in place over the UK towards the end of the first week, but look how little support it has at this point. Virtually all of the other runs in the GEFS are bringing milder air back to at least southern Britain at this point. The GFS operational was an outlier. So even though it was supported by the UK Met Office operational run, it seems as though that solution is not a very likely one. More evidence to suggest that milder air will have returned by the end of the first week. In fact, virtually all of the runs at this point are significantly above a 30-year average, which is indicated by the thick black line here. The ensemble mean, several degrees above it. But later on, it declines and it then remains very close to that 30-year norm. To summarise, above average and then dipping back towards it. Across the bottom, precipitation, rain at this point because the snow row doesn't rise above 2 and the maximum value it can take is 33, so a very, very low chance of snow in this part of the UK through the second week. There are spikes continuing to show throughout the second week though. It means there's an ongoing risk of rain, but towards the end it looks as though there are fewer on the plot, perhaps starting to turn drier. The 2-metre temperature data table for London, the columns are dominated by yellows and a significant amount of orange too. The yellows are the runs going for forecast maximums of between 11 and 15 Celsius. The oranges 16 to 20. There's even a little bit of this orangey brown colour, 21 to 25 Celsius, but 3% equals 1 run out of 33 which are being shown here. So it's a low chance of it turning very warm. But I think fairly mild or even very mild is probably the best description through the first few days. Later on, the amount of light green does increase. Those are runs going for maximums of between 6 and 10 Celsius. So that mild start, perhaps even very mild. We could well see temperatures in the south climbing to between 16 and 20 Celsius, but then later on they dip away back towards the average. Up to Manchester, it's a very similar air temperature profile, above average, and then it dips. The rainfall signal across the bottom, also similar. If anything, the spikes are bigger, so indicating higher rain totals. And even towards the end, there are still quite a few there. So the signal for drier conditions, which maybe is showing up on London, is less clear here as we're going northwards. 2-metre temperature data table for Manchester. Yellows early on, making up the bulk of these columns. But then the amount of light green increases. There's even a little dark green. Runs going for forecast maximums of between 1 and 5 Celsius. But the general pattern is similar to the London one, as is often the case at a slightly lower level. Mild to start off with, then perhaps dipping back towards the average later. Up to Glasgow to complete the journey northwestwards. The signal here is for air temperatures to be a little bit above the average through the first few days. Even that GFS operational run was an outlier here as well. So the colder scenario which it's painting at the end of week 1 seems to be an outlier even in the north of the UK. But just coming back to week 2 in general, the positive anomaly here is smaller than it was on the London and Manchester plots. Later on, there's perhaps a greater number of the individual runs dipping a little bit below that 30-year norm. Rain spikes are along the bottom. Well, there are lots of them. Some of them are quite big. it's wet throughout week 2. If this is correct, no noticeable signal here for it to turn drier later on. Perhaps perhaps a small decrease in the number of spikes there towards the end, but all in all, it's a wet scenario. Will there be any snow through week 2? In the north, well, snow row reaches a maximum of 11 out of 33, so a much higher chance than snow in the London area, but I'd say low to moderate. The emphasis here is on unsettled weather as we go through the second week. Here are the 2-metre temperatures in the data table format for Glasgow. To start off with, there is a reasonable amount of dark green there. It's 39%, so it is colder, noticeably so, than in southern and central regions, but the amount of yellow quickly rises, so this is pointing towards that milder air from the southwest. More and more of the individual runs in the GEFS are bringing it up across the northern part of the UK. And then it's, well, lots of light green through the rest of the week. Some yellow, even a little bit of the orange at the very end, and a continuing presence for the dark green, but it's in a minority throughout the rest of the period. So I think all in all, fairly close to the average once we get past the first few days, when there's that signal perhaps for it to be somewhat colder. It just depends on the transition to the milder air, moving it from the southwest, the timing of it. Then, as I say later on, it's a very average picture in general. The 10-day GEFS ensemble plot showing mean surface level pressure. It's valid for Saturday the 1st of April, perhaps not the best day to pick, the 1st of April. Nonetheless, here it is, and just some suggestions here that high pressure to the south may be starting to have an influence, but with that said, the surface level pressure is remaining low, but if anything, this is where the drier weather will be coming from the south. High pressure may be starting to build. I think at this point, it wouldn't really be having a great deal to say about things, but it's the general direction of travel. Perhaps it will be in the days which follow. And the ECM model, similar, but there are some differences. The yellow shading, the orange shading, a little bit further south. The jet stream perhaps therefore being a little bit further south than the GEFS mean was indicating. All in all, though, it's a changeable or unsettled scenario at this point. Low pressure parked between Iceland and the United Kingdom. More or less, it's home for much of the year. The mean surface level data pressure table for York, so we're going forwards through time rather than looking at a snapshot for one given day. Greens and blues early on, which are indicating low pressure, but the amount of yellow and orange increases, and there's even a little bit of red there at the very end. That's indicating over 1040 millibars, so very high pressure, but once more, 3% is just one run in the ensemble. I think to summarise this, a weak-ish signal for higher pressure later on. It's fitting in with the idea that I suggested for it to perhaps become somewhat drier at the very end in the south at least. So, to summarise, week 1, it's unsettled with showers or longer spells of rain and strong winds through the first few days. Colder air then pushes southwards, and there is a risk of snow showers in the north, but it probably becomes more settled towards the end of the week. And milder air is likely to be returning northeastwards, but there is uncertainty about the exact timing of that transition. Week 2, changeable with showers or longer spells of rain. Temperatures continue climbing through the first couple of days at least, but then they probably dip back towards the average. By the very end, there is a weak signal for drier conditions, but that's really focused on southern parts of the UK at this point only. The Atlantic is likely to stay dominant across the northern half of the country at least. So, There we have it. Unsettled, then colder with a risk of snow in the north. Also frosts becoming widespread, at least for a time, but it does look as though that milder air from the southwest will probably push back quite quickly. As I've been highlighting, there is a discrepancy in the timing of that between the various different computer models, but the majority of them have it returning across most of the UK by the end of week 1. It's then quite a mixed picture through week 2, but just that signal, keep your fingers crossed if you're hoping for something warmer and drier to develop as we head towards the end of the forecast period, at least in the south. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. As ever, if you did, then please remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons below. Thank you for watching now. Bye.